Hello and welcome to ProDrivers Clearinghouse webinar. Thank you for joining our exclusive event today. My name is Danielle Bufflin and I'll be facilitating behind the scenes. Your host today is ProDrivers Vice President of DOT Compliance, Russ Frantum. All attendees are muted. However, we do love to hear from you. Your questions are extremely important to us and we do ask that you type them or any comments that you might have right in the questions panel. We will follow up after the webinar as we are only scheduled to be here for 45 minutes. Everyone registered will receive the slide deck presentation as well as the recording of this webinar. For those of you just joining us, welcome once again to this exclusive ProDrivers Clearinghouse webinar. At this time, I'd like to get us kicked off with Mike Mitchell. He's been with ProDrivers for over 17 years in various roles and is currently our president. Please join me in welcoming Mike Mitchell. Take it away.
Thank you, Danielle. That certainly made me sound up there in age, which I am. And I consider it a privilege to be the president of ProDrivers. And also a privilege to say thank you for all of you guys attending today. Certainly interesting times we've all been living in this year, the most interesting times of my life for sure. These seminars that we've now developed, these offerings that we are now developing are really obviously an offshoot of the new way that we've been forced to do business. Lot more remote things. We're used to doing seminars in person around the country. And so what we've begun to offer is these type of things. We did a safety seminar last month, 3 different offerings. We're doing Russ is doing Clearinghouse for those that want to know more about it, and it's a privilege for us to do that. And we've got a couple other more ideas of offerings in the coming months we intend to do. We're going to be sending out in the next couple of weeks asking and soliciting input from each of you on things that you would like to know more about, that we could be in a position to talk about. Just for instance, in the coming weeks, we're going to be sharing a driver survey that we concluded. We do this annually, and we'll be sharing those results with anybody that would like to hear some overall information about drivers' perspectives of things. We find it fascinating. I think you would as well. And so let me close with this. Again, I thank you for the opportunity and we appreciate the opportunity to do these things and provide value to you as our clients and prospects. That's really what our aim is here, to leave you better than we found you, with some information. And I will close with the thing that's most dear to my heart and what we get to do every day is we're rebuilding, as each of you are rebuilding. We're about back to the levels we were pre-COVID, which we're thrilled to be at. But at the cornerstone of what we believe here at ProDrivers is that people matter. That's our drivers, that's our clients, that's prospects, frankly, that's every human being you come in contact with. And so this is just one of the ways that we can hopefully do that with each of you, is leave you a little bit better, because indeed you do matter. So with that, again, thank you for allowing us the privilege of meeting with you today and in your time. And with that, Danielle, let me throw it back to you so you can get this kicked off.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mike. And now I would like to introduce your host for today, Russ Frantum. Russell has been with ProDrivers for over 19 years and he's held various positions. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Business Management. He's been published twice in the Federal Registry and assisted in the frequently asked questions section for the Clearinghouse. He's completed multiple courses at the Transportation Safety Institute, conducts reasonable suspicion for supervisor training, mock DOT audits, and consulting with motor carriers on best practices and policies. It is my pleasure to turn this over to Russ Frantum.
Well, thanks, Danielle. Thanks, Mike, for the introductions. Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody listening to the webinar today. As stated, this will be a webinar about the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. And the intention is that we'll give you some general information, not do much deep dive into it, but give you enough information to be able to run with. In the presentation that you receive from us will be links and much more detailed information. The good point is it'll be all in one place, and you can click on those links based on what information that you're searching for out there. So our intention is to help you in your clearinghouse searches, understanding the clearinghouse and the information that's in there. So we'll get started with a quick little agenda, and let's talk about what is the clearinghouse. The Clearinghouse is a secure online database that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has established based on the drug and alcohol section of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which is 382. It went live January 6th of 2020. And the intent and purpose of it is that it's going to improve highway safety. It's going to make the motoring public, and along with truck drivers, it's going to remove drivers that are violating the regulations regarding drugs and alcohol, get them assistance quicker from a substance abuse treatment standpoint. But one of the big things in the intent is that we've all been in the business for a while, that drivers seem to forget when they fail the drug test to put it on their next employer's application. And the system was intended that employers would research previous employers and find that information. And if the applicant leaves it off and there's no ability to find it, it can sometimes slip through the cracks, especially based on the verification process that was currently in place regarding drugs and alcohol. So why the Clearinghouse? Well, the big reason is that it was added to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. Most of us know the Green Book that's out there. There are specific sections regarding this, and they're under 382, 701 through 727, and is mandated by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for all employers and motor carriers of CDL drivers to follow this regulations. There are no exceptions to that. So how does it work? The Clearinghouse requires Federal Motor Carrier regulated employers, medical review officers, substance abuse professionals, and consortium third-party administrators to query the database and to input information into the database regarding violations that have occurred. Every employer of CDL drivers is required to query, and you have to do it pre-employment and at least once every 12 months. You may run them more often, and we'll talk about releases and things that will allow you to do that. So as I mentioned, the people using it are employers. That's anyone who employs drivers, CDL. The CDL drivers themselves have access to the information, especially only the information that's reported about them. Medical review officers, substance abuse professionals, return to duty processes, and also consortiums and third-party administrators entering information on behalf of employers. State driver's license agencies will be able to use the information when issuing CDL licenses. We'll touch on that topic at the end of the webinar. Let's talk a little bit about who and how they're affected. As we said, anyone who employs CDL drivers must use the database when hiring drivers, and it must use it at least once every year. There's no ifs, ands, or buts behind the process, and they must also report information into the system as well. And we'll go into a little bit of detail about what information has to be reported as part of this presentation. So the big question is, what does it cost? And the cost is $1.25 per query. If you're using a consortium or a third party to get the information, they'll most likely have a fee that they add on top of that, but $1.25 is the cost. There is an unlimited plan that's available that requires about 19,600 queries to make it beneficial. So if you're a very large employer, that's an option for you. As an example, ProDrivers has about 4,000 drivers, and year to date, from January to June, we've run approximately 5,200. So with that number of drivers and applicants, the plan itself for unlimited isn't beneficial to us. So one of the big questions come is payment methods. And they'll take electronic funds transfers, credit cards, debit cards, Apple Pay, things like that. But the big thing that they won't take is checks. Whether they're certified checks, whether they're corporate checks, whether they're personal checks, they will not take any checks. You do have to go to pay.gov to process your payment through the system. There's not a surcharge or a fee for credit cards in there, but it is electronic. And keep in mind that if you're having a consortium or a third-party administrator do yours, you have to actually purchase the plan. They can't purchase the plan on your behalf. The plans have to be run through your account, through your process that is there. So, what are the penalties for not complying with the regulations? And it's covered under 49.521(b)(2)(c). Not using it or using it incorrectly or providing false information can result in civil penalties not to exceed $2,500 per offense. So if you hired a large group of drivers and didn't use the clearinghouse, you'd be subject to civil penalties for not using it. So one of the questions that drivers ask often is, hey, this is information about me, and how is it protected? And the system is actually set up that the only people who can obtain the information are people who have been given permission from the driver, and the driver has free access to their own information. It's a pretty complicated process for most drivers to set up their profile. It's a two-part authentication process for when the driver registers, and that employers are not allowed to set up profiles for the drivers. Drivers have to set up their own profiles in the system. That leads to the question of, if there's information in the system that a driver feels is incorrect, can they get the information changed? It is possible to get the information changed or removed, but only if the information is not accurate. They can't dispute the validity of a test or a refusal. But they have two options. They can use the data queue process, if you're familiar with that. That's the federally regulated process where you're submitting to the FMCSA your dispute, and it's a formalized process. They can also contact the party that inputted the information directly into the system and discuss the information that is there and have a conversation about it. If the party who put the information determines that the information they put in is not correct or inaccurate, the information can be deleted or modified by that party. So what that really means from a standpoint is from if an MRO enters the information, an employer can't change the information. If an employer enters the information, the MRO cannot change the information. It can only be changed by the party that inputted the information into the system. So, all right, so let's talk about pro drivers a little bit. So Danielle had mentioned that published in the Federal Register and also assisted with the frequently asked questions. We felt very fortunate that we got some of our questions inputted to give guidance to motor carriers in understanding what our role can be in there and what it can't be. In the case of pro drivers, we have a service agreement with our clients. Those clients, every one of them designates us as an agent on their behalf for Federal Motor Carrier Safety regulations. And we do have a standalone drug and alcohol program. So we maintain our drivers in our drug and alcohol program. We are listed as an employer for the purposes of the clearinghouse. So what does that boil down to? There's a Federal Register that was published in December 23rd of 2016. And in that register, it designates that, yes, staffing and leasing agencies can be employers and are employers for the purposes of 382. and also for 391 when acting on behalf of a motor carrier. We are also subject to audit, just like a motor carrier when it comes to that regulations. So not only can we be audited through our motor carriers when they are, we can also be directly audited from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and DOT. So employers are defined for the clearinghouse under 382-107. It encompasses driver staffing agency that employ person who operate CMVs and are subject to this regulation. So if anybody wants to go out and read that, understand the regulation and how leasing staffing agency pro drivers can assist, that's the purpose behind that regulation and the interpretation of it. All right, let's talk about the clearinghouse itself and the queries that are available. And the query is just simply a check into the record that's in the database of the system. There are no records in the system prior to January 6th of 2020, only records that are after January 6th, 2020. There's two types of records that can be obtained. One is a full query. Full queries require the driver to have a profile, and when a employer puts a query into the system, the driver must log into their profile. They'll see that someone is requesting the information in their profile. They'll electronically sign in the clearinghouse, and that information will be returned to the employer. The driver themselves can see the exact same information that the employer is going to be seeing at the same time. And there's a limited query. Limited queries are exactly what it says. It's going to tell you whether there is or is not negative information in the system. And if there is negative information in the system, it's going to require that a full query be processed. That full query must be processed within 24 hours. A driver who does not consent to a full query when spun off from a limited query must be removed from a safety-sensitive function until time that they do accept the full query and you can see the information that's in there. Most likely it means that the driver has violated some type of one of the regulations under 382, and you'll see what that is. They will have to complete a substance abuse professional program evaluation and return to duty testing prior to being able to return in a safety-sensitive function, or if you have a policy that if you have any violations or a driver has any violations that they're removed from employment, that would be the opportunity to do that as well. So for limited consents, the driver and the employer must have a signed release, and the signed release can be what's called an evergreen release, meaning it's good for the entire time of employment of the driver. And if you see on the bottom left-hand side, when you get these slides, you'll be able to click on, and that will take you to the Clearinghouse website, and it will give you the Clearinghouse website sample limited query consent form. The limited consent form that you're seeing in the slide, this is pro drivers. We have modified it slightly. There are potential out there, depending if you have bargaining units, things along that line, that you may have to negotiate how many times a limited query consent can be run. But the intent behind ours and the sample is that a limited query consent can be run at any time, any place during the course of employment. That's there. So if you run a limited query, you're going to get back a couple different things. The ideal to receive back is that it says driver is not prohibited. That does not tell you that a driver has a profile, because the driver does not have to have a profile to run a limited query. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if there's information in the system, you're going to receive back that says driver prohibited or full query needed. In that case, you want to make sure your policies are in place to say that A driver will immediately or within 24 hours accept the full query. You can see what that information is, or you'll remove them from a safety-sensitive function until such time it happens. So how to order a limited or a full query? You can see in the bottom. We won't go into the details of this call, but you see in the bottom there's a click here for step-by-step instructions on how to obtain the information, how to order the information for a query. It's a very simple process. Honestly, takes probably under 30 seconds that when you have the information in front of you to enter the information. So here's a couple examples. The one on the left is telling you that a driver is not prohibited. The one on the right would show what would happen afterwards if the driver was prohibited. It would tell you the information of what the violation was and the outcome of this. And once again, there's a link on the bottom to get detailed information about those results. You'll also see in that information how when you're looking into your query history to look and see the differences between the colors that are there. There's yellow, there's blue, there's red, and those indicate different stages of the process in the driver's signing. And you can see those examples on in the step-by-step instructions. So we've been conducting in-person seminars just prior to COVID and up till March. And the biggest questions we get now and at those in-person seminars is about a refusal. So there's been some clarification and honestly some industry-changing thought process from what has been standard. And when it comes to refusal for a pre-employment drug test. So the things I'm about to say only apply to a pre-employment drug test. They don't apply to a random reasonable suspicion, things like that. Those will still be the same as they always have. If a driver refuses, they refuse. But under 40.191, a driver has, for pre-employment, a driver does not have to take a pre-employment drug test. They have every opportunity up to a point to say, you know what, I don't want this job. And the definition of that point is now at the point when they're called back to provide the specimen. And if they walk out after being called back to provide that specimen. In a lot of cases, they're saying basically when they're handed a urine specimen cup. So if your driver goes to the collection site, sits in the lobby, and walks out for pre-employment prior to that, then it's not a refusal. And one of the reasons that we're really touching on this hard is because it is an employer's responsibility to report refusals. Once again, you can find that information on the click here to learn more. That'll take you to 40.191 and find that. And the wording is, once the collection process has commenced from a failure standpoint. It's a pretty long and lengthy description behind it, but that's the easiest summary is up to the point for pre-employment when a specimen cup is handed to a driver. Are current drivers required to register? Current drivers are not required to register. So if you have a driver who has been employed with you prior to January 5th, the driver does not need to create a profile. You can run a limited query as part of the annual query, and you'll get the information back. A driver does have to register when applying for a job because a pre-employment query has to be run. And in order to accept a pre-employment query, the driver has to log in and accept it electronically inside the clearinghouse. The only way to accept it electronically inside the clearinghouse is to have a profile. We talked about it's a little bit of a complicated process to register drivers. There's an 11-page document that walks through the step-by-step process to do that. And once again, we've provided a link to that document in the clearinghouse on the bottom of this slide for anyone to review. Let's talk about medical review officer. and their responsibilities. So medical review officers within 2 business days must enter verified positives or any violations that are reportable under their requirements to the clearinghouse. They report the information on positives and information the employer does not. And keep in mind, this is only for drug. MROs do not report any alcohol violations. The employer is responsible for alcohol violations, whether it's above 0.04, DWIs, CMV, things like that. So what's our role as an employer, or your role as an employer? We have to report any violations of drug and alcohol that are not reported by the MRO. If you employ drivers and have them go through substance abuse programs, if they test positive, you will need to enter the return to duty results. If you're hiring a driver who has just completed or has not completed one, hadn't been employed since completing one, and you're the first employer since testing positive or having a violation, you'll have to report the return to duty test results along with the pre-employment. What is actual knowledge? Actual knowledge is when a driver has controlled substance or alcohol violations that you as an employer have actual knowledge of. In the case, it may be that a driver is charged with a DWI and a CMV while in your employment. You as an employer are responsible when that driver receives that citation for entering that into the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. You can either do it yourself or use your consortium third-party administrator to input that information. Actual knowledge, though, is defined under 382.10, and it's direct observation or information provided by previous employer, a traffic citation, or an employee's admission of alcohol-controlled substance use under 382.121. And you want to make sure that you understand that regulation before reporting the driver into the system. So what is an SAP roles? And SAP stands for Substance Abuse Professional. Their job, when they're certified, is to evaluate a driver who has had a violation of 382 to make determination of what actions the driver must take in order to return to work and to follow that driver through that process and issue them a certificate that they've completed that process when they are. Talk about State Driver's License Administration, DMVs. So DMVs have been pushed back until January 6th of 2023. DMVs can voluntarily use the clearinghouse, but they don't have to. Lots of the reason behind it is that funding, legislature approval, things like that. When you're changing driver's license at the state level, we saw the same thing when medical certificates had to be registered, the MVRs. It took states a long time to do that. But when it does go into effect, January 6th of 2023, the state driver's license agencies will have to query the clearinghouse prior to issuing or reissuing a CDL license. If the driver has a violation or is prohibited, they will not be able to issue a commercial driver's license to that driver. So that's what will be coming along. So let's talk about some tips. So when drivers enter their profile, or when you're entering a query, you need to match it to the CDLIS, the Commercial Driver's License Information System. Lots of states have leading zeros on their driver's licenses. The driver has to enter those leading zeros to be matched to the CDLIS, and you as an employer, when entering the order, have to enter it at the same time. They all have to match to be able to get that back. You'll get an error message if it doesn't. You'll have to research and find out where it is. The other example is letters. So if there's a letter on the front of a driver's license, it must be entered as well. So other things that we've found out along the way is, from a training standpoint, you have to make sure that every employee in your organization understands when and how to send someone for a drug test. There's no retraction of information. So if a driver has an accident, motor vehicle accident, but doesn't meet the standards to be DOT drug tested, but you send them for a DOT drug test and they test positive, the MRO is 100% required to report that to the clearinghouse. They can't remove the information even though the wrong drug test was administered. And that information is going to stay until that driver completes a substance abuse professional. A driver's legal recourse would be to sue you civilly or sue us civilly for violating their rights in the reason for testing. Same issue comes along as if you send a driver for a drug test for company policy, things like that, and your collection site uses the wrong chain of custody, and the driver tests positive, the MRO is going to report it, and there's nothing that can be done to change that information. The MRO has done their job, their part, in testing the sample, and there used to be in the past the ability to upgrade or downgrade DOT test to a non-forensic, non-CDL, unregulated test. That option is no longer available. It cannot be removed from the system. So as we stated, if you have questions, if you want to discuss things one-on-one, get additional information, things like that, you can type your questions in. You can email me. My email address is russell.brantham@prodrivers.com. Feel free to call me, area code 651-538-4439. Very happy to have these conversations. It's new to all of us. And by January 6th of 2021, every single driver in the United States should have a query run on them if they're employed during that time period, whether it's pre-employment or an annual review. So appreciate your time today and be safe. Have a great day. Thanks. Bye.
All right. Thank you once again to Russ for joining us today and all of you for joining us. As a reminder, you will be receiving the slide deck and recording of this webinar, and our next ProDrivers webinar for clients on Clearinghouse is July 14th at 11 a.m. Central, 12 p.m. Eastern. If you have a colleague that was unable to attend, please send them the registration. If you have any questions, please reach out to your local ProDrivers representative. Have a great and safe rest of your week.